Reading David Mills' work calls to mind that line from Whitman, "He contains multitudes." His work chronicles the African diaspora from apartheid South Africa to the Caribbean, the United States, moving in time from the present day to the era of slavery. In Mills' new project, Talking to the Bones, the first poetic work on New York's African-American burial ground, America's oldest and largest slave cemetery, Mills shows us how the past is not dead, how the spiritual and bodily traumas suffered in that dark time continue to resonate, to speak, and demand to be heard. Giving flesh to the past does not always bring undiluted pain in Mills' verse. It also brings ecstasy worth preserving in words, as in his evocative memory of a childhood trip to his father's native Jamaica, or in an imaginative recreation of the night Ike and Tina Turner consummated their love for one another while Bo Diddley rocked on the radio. His poems also frequently celebrate the endurance of black bodies and souls, how black folk have so often made a way out of no way, or as Mills states, each decade an improvisation. His poem, University of Robben Island, begins with an epigraph from Nelson Mandela, "We shall make this prison a university." The poem goes on to take that abstraction and recreate in words that historical moment fully realized. Here, sticks and pens and fingers are pencils. What's useless is useful. Blackboards are carved in thighs of sand. A limestone cove's our lecture hall. A hunger that's both one's thoughts and gut craving victuals. This dialogue between thoughts and gut, or more broadly, the flesh, is a persistent motif in his work, as so many of his poems meditate on the mystery of language and its capacity to mediate between the mind and the flesh. In Summer's Thumb, Mills asks us to notice how the mind entertains ideas the devil would cross off his guest list. Don't doubt this alphabet. Let language let language utter itself again and again, like a body, nude, supine. Let flesh sweat and bud like April, maple cream, sap. Poet Terence Hayes notes of Mills's prize-winning collection, The Sudden Country, a vivid combination of wildness and refinement, observing how the poems glow with the heat of human history and human carnality, the heat of blood pulsing in this poet's gifted hand. If I tried to enumerate all of David Mills' accolades, he would never get to read. But I would be remiss if I didn't name a few. He has an MA in creative writing from New York University, as well as a MFA from Warren Wilson College. He's a cum laude Yale graduate, has received fellowships from Breadloaf, the New York Foundation of the Arts, and Soros Foundation. His poems have appeared widely in prestigious publications, including Plowshares, Fence, Jubilat, and Callaloo. His poetry has received the Hughes Knight Award, the Brio Award, and the Pan-African Literary Forum Prize. For 3 years, he lived in Langston Hughes's landmark Harlem home, and many of you have known the thrill of witnessing Mills' electrifying performance of Hughes' work, which he has shared with us here at SUNY Oneonta on several occasions. Tonight, we are thrilled to bring him back to our campus to share with us his own acclaimed poetry. Won't you please help me welcome David Mills?
Probably one of the best introductions I've heard about myself. I'm sitting over there like, who's that guy? I don't know him. Good evening. Good evening. Okay, thank you. I do thank you for being out here. We were enjoying a little chow and having some transportation things. I'm not as tall as Mr. Hovis, so I might have to... You can hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. So, I got this grant to work on these poems about the African or the Negro burial ground, which is in New York City. I'll say a little bit and I'll be kind of giving notes as we go along, so bear with me. The burial ground was opened from 1711 to 1795. New York City, up until about the mid-19th century, was only 1.5 miles long and 1 mile wide. Any of you either from New York City or been down there? Okay. So it was basically from Chambers Street to Bowling Green, right? That's how small it was. So that's where the whole city was. And the African burial ground was outside of the city. So north of Chambers Street, it was bordered on the west by Broadway, east Center Street, south was Chambers, north Duane. It was about 7 acres. So just kind of have that in mind as I'm reading. It's not New York City as you think of it now. This first piece, any of you see Mary Poppins? Okay, so Chim Chimchery, Dick Van Dyke. So there were enslaved boys who worked as, they would call them apprentices, not chimney sweeps. And this is a persona poem in the voice of one of these young boys. A master sweep would be an older African-American man who was also enslaved. Any of you ever heard the term put a fire under him? So that comes from chimney sweep, because you would start sometimes at 4 or 5 years old, and these kids would be terrified to go up into the flue, so they would light a fire under them to make them, go up and work. I'll just read and I'll say some things afterwards. The Apprentice. I'm what happens when a house breathes out black breath in a New York throat, tracked caterpillar, what they think of me, owners of these homes and white master who hires me out to black master sweep, elbows, ankles, knees, zigzagging, chimneys, squeeze of heat and dusk, soot head to toe, dirt thick as a shirt, palms facing out, stomach up against and empty. I could die here. My life up in nothing but smoke. But brush above my head, I chuck soot, chip tar with a scraper, black rain peppering my neck, the pink rim of my eyes, filth to the sides of flues, mazes sticky with poison, hearth to cap damper. Started prenticing when I was 6, 18 now, flesh, leathery, ankles swell to black apples. Growing is a stunt. Can't say which is better, cramped heat or winter's chill. My cry, soot, oh, weep, on the streets or pinched in the flue. My days, a brick wide and a brick and a half long. So what happened was literally the width of these flues, was about a brick wide and a brick and a half long. Imagine even if you're 10 years old, that's like pretty tight, right? Okay, so this is what these young men were climbing up into. And they were doing this in the winter time, so it would be terribly cold outside, and then they're getting into this flue that was like incredibly hot. So you're doing this kind of, transfer from temperatures. The first cancer that we know of that was sort of industrial was actually with the chimney sweeps. It's called soot board, and it was a cancer of the scrotal area. So I'll leave it at that. We'll move on. Oh, so there were 15,000 bodies, or there are, in this cemetery, right? There are 400 that they've sort of marked off. And as I said, the oldest and largest slave cemetery in the United States. There's only one name of a person that they know their first and last name of these 15,000 bodies, and they don't even know where they are. So there are graves that they just have marked with numbers, right? So this next piece is called Mothered by Mother. It's 3 coffins in one grave. Anyone want to take a guess as to why that might be? 3 coffins, yes. Okay, that is a way to think, yeah. That could happen in some instances.
Family?
Exactly, it was a mother with her 2 babies. So this is called Mothered by Mother. Burials 142, 144, 149. Head left, jaw, and it's a persona poem in the voice of this mother. Head left, jaw hovering above that same shoulder, right shoulder pressed against my coffin, one baby's casket just above my heart, another baby on my right, coffin waist high, reaching for an ankle that no longer is. Trinity, 3 coffins, 1 grave, snug. These infants, mine, as we told time to go. And in their own sweet time, death's inspectors tell me I'm between 25 and 30. Say, one of my children never knew 2 months. Say, the other between half a dozen of those and a year. See, all of us now mothered by Mother Earth and murder's milk. So I can go long. I try to, put some short ones in between these longer ones. So the first African-American poet who was published in this country was a gentleman named Jupiter Hammond. And I'm embarrassed to say, I've read his work and didn't even realize he lived in New York until I started working on this project. So I was sort of playing with his first name, Jupiter. It's obviously the name of a planet. So this poem is sort of figuratively bouncing back and forth between him as person, him as planet, if you would. Let me see if there's anything else. He lived in Queens Village. Is there anything else I want to say? I won't get into all the Greek and Roman mythology. Oh, and there's an asteroid belt, I should say, between Mars and Jupiter. And there's all of this kind of like rocks and asteroids between there. Part of why that is the pull of gravity of Jupiter didn't allow these rocks and stuff to coalesce to form a planet, and that sort of plays into this poem figuratively. If there's anything else, I'll tell you afterwards. So it's called Deem Me, Pitter Potter. And Pitter in the word Jupiter is, let me get this right, Pater is Latin's father, and Pitter is also like etymologically related to Pater. Deem me, Pitter Potter, to suggest Jupiter Hammond. Deem me distant, Jupiter, Jew, Zeus, shared root, Pitter of Latin's pater, father, pitter patter, Zeus the father, pitter patter, make sound light, rapid, repeat, Neptune, Poseidon, Dis, Pluto, my siblings, Helen seas, cosmic our realm, cosmic our parcels, heaven, my realm. 2. But here on the bottom of America's airy envelope, I'm just a wanderer, spinning yet held in this colonial orbit, this gravitational pull, this solar system, one of billions. 3. With his telescope glommed onto flickering mysteries, if only Galileo could have discovered me there on the shores of his surname, Nazareth tucked in the foothills, between the Jordan and Mediterranean, where what I covet of anglers and God, where sudden calms and violent storms of wind and wave are normal, like my surface, where there's a brick-red tempest 30,000 miles long, that infidel, that stellar dervish. 4. Stars are the sky's twinkling preachers, the firmament, Galilee's vertical sea, something my Savior can walk upon. If Galileo could prove things helio, I thought as a child I could pray to my Lord, crack the crust of my icy core. 5. Deep space, mere sea where the splash has vanished. Ganymede, Callisto, my ardent moons, one a maiden, me a heavenly body, fettered to this system, colonial, solar, yet I'm the largest planet, crawl vast enough to hold 8 others, including the one I'm on. But I lack a solid surface. This, what happens to a man who never questions his servitude. 6. Think of the orbit between an Oyster Bay estate and New York City as the orbit between Jupiter, me, and Mars. An asteroid belt, galactic scraps, the sky's parasites, slapdash residue, a surfeit of genesis and suffering that brought me about thousands of millions of years ago. My people, unable to gather, become a planet because of my presence, my words, their gravity, their vast magnetic field, so much hydrogen and helium, my hot, defeated air keeping them from coalescing. 7. Snagged in the fabric of space-time, everywhere, invisible, baffling. I neither absorb, admit, or reflect. Dark matter, 95th percentile. Recognize a situation's gravity. Learn to influence things indirectly. Affect how bodies seeking and meting out freedom move. Stand before me. Encourage your eyes to adapt. In just minutes, you'll glimpse heaven, the cosmos, its snarling, displaced, dark majority. So, dark matter, you can clap, but I'm not that insecure with you. Dark matter is 95% of what we know of as the universe, but it's invisible, right? And Torben D. Morrison has a collection of essays, Playing in the Dark. And what I'm sort of getting at is that sense of the invisibility of these enslaved folks, but it's still impacting the culture, right? And Jupiter was what you might call a house Negro or conservative, and so he actually preached against, he was very religious Christian, he preached against the enslaved getting freedom. So that whole sense of like, my words, their gravity, their vast magnetic field, keeping them from coalescing. Remember how I said in the asteroid belt you have these rocks? So if they came together, there'd be the power of the planet. But he was against this, okay? Are you with me out there? We're hanging in? Okay, cool. All right. So as I said, he was the first to have a poem. It was a broadside. It wasn't a whole book. And that was in 1761. So even though this book is about the African burial ground in New York City, I included a couple of pieces about Phillis Wheatley, who was the first Negro, as they would call us then if they were being kind, to have a whole book published, right? Which was 1773, poems on subjects religious and moral. I might have inverted a little bit. And Hammond had written a few poems criticizing her Christianity or her piety. So I have two pieces in there. This is called The Almost Audience. I was actually in London in December, and she almost had an audience with King George III. I just want to see if there's anything else I want to say before. So the ship she came on was owned by a gentleman named Gwen, and the captain's name was Fitch. I'll just read, and if there's anything I want to share. And she came from what would be thought of today as Senegal, but was called Senegambia back then, West Africa. The Almost Audience for Phillis Wheatley. And pay attention to the last word. The Almost Audience. Of Senegambia and 7, she should have been of the not to be taken. Oh, so young girls were considered not as valuable because they thought they couldn't work and they weren't of childbearing age. So it was also interesting, in quotation marks, that they abducted her and she was only 7 years old. The Almost Audience. Of Senegambia and 7, she should have been of the not to be taken, the not high price, for a not prime boy is a girl, of the unsuitable labor, birth, not work, and that years away. Some of the captured, their spirits, ships sinking inside them. But there might be a rising up, so she was of the constant watch, the on your guard, the danced on deck, the merchant Gwen and Captain Fitch, the sterling purchased, oiled and slicked before the shore, sold and resold in Boston Harbor, profit, barter, and harvest, barter, harvest, and profit, trinket slaves and salt cod, trinket, salt cod, and slave, bought, then brought on the middle passage, but would one day read passages of her work in London, neither storage, cash crop, nor export, bidden thought, garnering an almost audience with George III, an actual one with Washington. For on a ship, your prayer is to reach as well as return, where once sharks were horizontal commas parsing a sea's endless sentence. She who'd been named for the schooner that brought her to Boston, 3 months crumpled in the hull, like being trapped in a capsized macaw's rancid beak, the squawk, the whistle, the mimic of the ocean's moods or inhuman moans, that unequilateral tragic triangle. She remembers parrots and Savannah oil palms, charcoal heads, constant chatter, pearl millet gleaming in their beaks. Boston worthies called her parrot an inky mimic. But so little of that life in her tutored lines, merchant, servant, sickly infants, more words but no means to publish them. The imprisoned husband, a free black grocer who set penury on a gimpy table. Poems on subjects religious and moral. Hell is an elegy one never finishes. Weeks before Christmas finds her week before Christmas. In her eyes leaking northern light, she might have recalled Horace, Homer, declension, and Greek, fame's listing shimmer, those homilies on Washington and milk at the Old South Meeting House. Although emancipated, she might have thought of escape to join the angelic train, embarking on the ship, sailing backwards through her name, Phyllis. Does anyone know why I say the ship sailing backwards through her name, Phyllis? Anyone who's under 25? The word ship is in her name, Phyllis, P-H-Y-L-L-I-S. Ship sailing backwards. spelled backwards. Okay, so it's like, hey, why is this guy putting these trick questions here? I thought we were supposed to listen to you. Don't stress me out. One of the things that was kind of intense, I'm like, okay, I'm looking at these, bones or what have you, and I have no names, and so some of the forensic anthropologists, I might be getting this wrong, or archaeologists, they were able to figure out what people died of or certain ailments they had in life, but no names. So I started saying, I need to have a conversation with these bones, and started just in my head, asking questions, what happened to you? Who were you? Blah, blah, blah. So then I literally started writing the questions down. This is when you have too much time on your hands, I suppose. Started writing the questions down, and then I would imagine they were answering me. I'm not a huge fan of some of Berriman's sentiments, but you can think of Henry and Mr. Bones a little bit here. So they know this woman was shot and killed. She was shot in her face, and her wrist was severely broken. So this is me as voice, interlocutor, if you would, and her spirit responding. So I have about 12 or 13 of these poems in the manuscript. Talking to the bones. What of your face? A bullet is nearly as blunt as a comment. Your wrist? Witness my resistance. How so? The wrist twisted an ashy sky under my skin. Who put the ball beneath your rib? This is what led to a musket seeking flesh that once sought freedom. Who placed you above an old man's bones? Shallower the grave, less pork knuckle between here and heaven. Why only a right rib cage? What we leave the earth, when we leave the earth, is not ours to say. So her whole left rib cage had been destroyed. And I appreciate the applause, but you don't necessarily have to. I won't cry if you don't, The interred. So one of the other things, often, we'll say, they enslaved these Africans, blah, 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 but it's never a specificity. And one of the things that was difficult and interesting is people were from different cultures and different countries. They didn't speak the same language, and they're on these ships together, and then they're here, and they have to kind of figure out a way. So this is just a list poem, and you could think of the African burial ground, regrettably, it became like a toxic waste dump. There were tanneries and kiln factories, so where you made leather and then where you made pottery. They built some of their offices or factories on the outskirts or even sometimes within the burial ground, and they would throw their waste into it, right? So this is combining all these names of different places where people came from, but also with some of the detritus, the garbage that was thrown in there. It's called the interred. Angolans, Fon, Senegambian, Caribbean, Akan, Ashanti, East Africans, Munsi Indians, Ghanaian, Yoruba, Popo, Guru, pottery shards, cowhides and horns, cowhides and horns, pottery shards, cowhides and horns, cowhides and horns, and pottery shards, Arada, Nagos, Fula, Gur, Fan, Aja, Adra, those of the Bight of Benin, of the Bight of Biafra, of the Gold Coast, or Niger Delta, Jamaican, pottery shards, cowhides and horns, pottery shards, cowhides and horns, and pottery shards, Muskies, Nigerian, Spanish Negroes, Cameroon, Malagasy, Antiguan, Barbados, Coromantee, Angolan, Gambian, Europeans, indentured, Senegalese, pottery shards, cowhides and horns, and pottery shards, cowhides and horns, and pottery shards, and cowhides and horns, Spanish Indians, those of Guinea-Bissau, the Kingdom of Whydah, of Madagascar, or Old Calabar, Malayan, Mauritanian, Wuda, Igbo, Ofra, those from Southeast Africa, Cape Coast Castle of West Central Africa, the Congo, pottery shards, cowhides and horns, pottery shards, cowhides and horns, and pottery shards, Maroons, Namibians, Liberians, Sudanese, Fulba, human beings being humans, humans being human. Okay, so as I said, the city was 1.5 miles long and 1 mile wide. Columbia University, it was called King's College, was down in that area, like what would be like the West Village. It was on Robinson Street. Actually, initially, it was a one-room schoolhouse attached to Trinity Church, which figures very prominently in slavery in New York. So, in 1788, and you could be a medical school student. Think about this. I know you'd be like, wow, this is crazy. You could be a medical school student at 15 years old back then, right? So, they started expanding the school and they needed bodies for anatomy class. They weren't able to get them from the wealthier cemeteries, Trinity Church being one of them, so they started breaking into the Negro or African burial ground. Resurrection men were men, and they were all men who were paid to exhume bodies for these reasons. Mort safes, people would put iron bars over graves or cement over them so you couldn't do anything. Physic is just, medicine. Cerements were things you wrapped bodies in. Matthew 27 verse 7 is a verse in the Bible about the potter's field where you bury foreigners. Sons of Galen was a Greek physician, but Sons of Galen was a term used for doctors. And Bone Bill, the Common Council, which now would be the City Council, tried to pass a bill to stop these robberies. So this is about the Columbia Medical School grave robbers, 1788. It's called assignment. And I'll share this one other thing. The students were sometimes so kind of mean-spirited, they might hang a limb out a window, and like if someone was passing by, they would say, oh, this is your mother's leg, right? And they actually did that once. It was a young white kid who was walking by, and his mother had died like about a week before that. So he freaked out, he went back and got his father, and like a whole band of white men came, and they were basically gonna like literally hang all of these students, right? Some of them 15 years old, and that's how the Negroes found out that they were also exhuming black bodies. Assignment. There'd been the donated, the unclaimed, the criminal. At times when the North fell short, the South packed bodies in hogshead cask. With enrollment bloated on Robinson Street, King's College became Columbia. That once one-room schoolhouse joined at Trinity Church's hip had a new name and address in the new republic. The hitherto, now the hereafter. So how do medical school students ply their jarring art and crafts when the student body has grown, yet the dead bodies have not? The city's graveyards, off limits to paupers and Negroes and seldom pawed by resurrection men, there those that loved those who left visited regularly, had mort safes and guards. Death separates men by salt and class, by tears and tears. February 3rd, a freedman's petition. Most humbly, sirs, young student of the physic, under the cover of the dual darkness, the night and the hearts, during merciless sallies repair to our grounds. We know we are not to congregate at night, but take risks to cloak loved ones in cerements. These students too often interrupt our earth, our fallen, infant, and elderly, no mere specimens, but deeply cared for, deeper than the graves they're buried in. If students cannot cease, we seek decency. Short-lived plea. For white lads in wool suits sculpt cold, moonless streets at obtuse angles, past hunt sacks of rubbish to the boneyard, grave riflers seeking recently turned earth, the newly deceased in winter, when death intends to keep bone and organ banded. In haste, they filch, knowing decay works nearly as fast. To keep stones from crying out, they uncork coffins with wooden shovels, return the earth, then lug their borrowed quarry to class. This was sure, this was cheap, this was studying, this was hit these bodies as if they were books. This was Matthew 27, verse 7. This was an open secret anointed by the elite. Autopsy's insights like New York's expansion built on captive backs. No telling how many Negro cadavers those two young sons of Galen harvested when the city's one scalpel school was just muddy cobbles from the burial ground. Here, the nearby, and in life, the neglected anatomical fodder. Columbia's labs and classes or New York's hospital not-for-credit courses might have been their final resting place. Here, no postmortems to pinpoint conditions loved ones could shirk. Just anatomical abattoirs, garlanded with black cadavers, corpses mangled by curiosity and sternal saws, bubbling in bake kettles, harpoon genitals, bone spurs sandwiched between the headboard and linen of a student cot. Sacrilege for Christians who believe only an unbothered body could gleam in the kingdom of God. But the deceased no longer need to accost the blood's troubling sugar. So what if a gallbladder's gone, a pancreas is pawned? Who cares if the legislature passes a bone bill? The dead had no standing as property. Only two-legged real estate could properly be considered property. Hell, at the end of the day, they were just homework. Abattoirs, places are slaughterhouses and sternal saws, the saws they use to cut open a body when you're doing like an autopsy. So I said a minute ago, Trinity Church figured in the African burial ground. They allowed Negroes or the enslaved to go to church at Trinity, and it was actually sort of the spiritual guard, if you would, of the economic fortress of Lower Manhattan. Literally, they built it sort of at the top of that area to kind of maintain some sort of spiritual power over it. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Peru, but Machu Picchu is a similar thing for Cusco, right? So this is a piece about the church, but Negroes are not allowed to be buried there, so just sort of see if you can follow with that. Colonial Cemetery, Trinity Church, 1697 to 1795. Earth off limits to the bones of who, owned by the bones of who could attend Trinity Church. Earth off limits to the bones of who they own. The bones of who? No names, right? All right. Anyway, I hope that one, you didn't miss that, did you? It was kind of what's going on out there? This guy's crazy. I know that, right? So here's another one of those talking to the bone pieces, and it's talking to that man who I said had a first and last name, the only one we know of those 15,000 bodies, Joseph Caston. And there was a cabinet maker who was hired by some of the owners to make coffins for their enslaved. And this is the way we know this guy, Joseph Caston's name, but we don't know where he's buried. So that's the only first and last name we have, but we still can't say where he's buried. Talking to the bones, Joseph Caston's spirit. What was it like to have as many letters in your name as colonies on this coast? To be known in life offers no escape from death. Had you made Joshua Delaplane's acquaintance? Death, a tragic cabinet, is it not? Joshua Delaplane is the guy who built the coffins. When did Delaplane put you in his bank account? My account? With God. How did you die with a given and a surname? The first shall have a last, and the last shall have a first. So, how many of you are familiar with the New York Stock Exchange? Okay, so it actually started under a buttonwood tree in New York City. They were exchanging financial instruments under a tree. And not even a half a block away from there was the slip on Wall and Water where the ships would come in with the enslaved, and they were selling them right there. There were financial instruments that were being sold in order to sort of maintain the slaveocracy. They had financial instruments for cotton, for shipping, so there's a very intimate relationship between what we think of as finance, and when you think of Wall Street as a kind of metonym for economic power in this country, it's very connected to the slave trade, northern and southern. How many of you wear Brooks Brothers clothes or are familiar with it? Okay, so maybe I'm dating myself, Brooks Brothers actually started making their money initially from selling clothes for the enslaved to wear. Guineaman is a name for a slave ship. Black gold was the name they used to refer to the enslaved Africans. They, meaning whites or whomever, could knew a slave ship was coming into port even before they saw it because the smell was so rancid coming in off the Atlantic. There were dead bodies on the ships, people are defecating on themselves, there was no bathroom, I'm saying, for the enslaved. They're chained and they're having to go, on themselves, and it's just running in the bottom of the ship. So you could smell the ship before you could see it, miles off. Let me see if there's anything else I want to say. Let me leave it at that. Oh, okay, and at a certain point in this slave market, they were also selling grain, like wheat and stuff, so you could buy a black person and buy a bag of wheat, go figure. Go to your local Walmart. This is called auction. Hell's unbidden hello. An epigraph. It was the site of a first official established slave market where all passed a law appointing a place for more convenient hiring of slaves, stating all Negro and Indian slaves and they enslaved enslaved Native Americans, are let out to be hired at the market house at the Wall Street Slit, which by 1726 was called and also included a meal market. New York City Common Council, December 1711, poem. The reek proclaimed the unseen but surely limping Guineaman, a seasick fist clutching black gold. A wind coming in off the Atlantic had borne 3 months of the African's terror, that stench, sweat's unanswered dread. A cupboard of dying feces and vomit, a punch smashed against any and every dockside nostril, cruelty's cheap perfume. Forced to endure during that crossing, every why in those abducted eyes, here was what the ocean failed to answer. Hell's first hello. A street nudged by the East River, rowboats, oars, all forearm and palm. Pier 17, where Wall meets Water Street. The old slip, a white man, all tummy and mutton chops, mounts a platform, hoists a gavel while 50 Africans, fettered, manacled, lumber from the hold up 6 dank steps, huddling under a wooden roof where, at the foot of this city and sin, Indians and the colony's long since slaves can be rented, hired, or let out by the day or week. Uneyed, mobile, downtime, cozy, lazing beneath the forked shadow of a dragon beam, yet sent to seek new ways to scoop a shilling and sweat. Not the recent arrivals. For sale, young strapping buck along with a Negro wench. Inquire at 57 Janeway Lane. Bought, traded, auctioned, oft, to till and build, to chore and cook. New York, second only to the city of Cooper, Ashley, and Indigo. Mid-April azaleas, Sumter, and Rice. Second only to a land's constricted neck, a peninsula and its admitted acres. Second only to a way of life cinched on 3 sides by water. 750 miles and a supposed world away. But in and around this un-southern structure, this raving, cramped gazebo, here buyers circle icky cobbles, eye ballooning chests, the smalls of back scoops and flanks, preparing for a nearly naked sale, a white middle and index finger, noses along a trounced brow's hard horizon. Beads of sweat, signal and gift, brought to his tongue's inquisitive coast. Smack, a colony's first taste of a continent. Not salty, hence not sick, an African sold along with a knob of unsifted cereal grass. Does anyone know why they might have run their fingers across their forehead and tasted it? These were the white individuals who were buying the enslaved or assumed to be enslaved. Anyone want to take a guess? So there was this belief that if there was salt in the enslaved person's sweat, they were sick. So they would run their hand, the white men, and they were mostly men, would run their hand over the forehead or somewhere on the face and taste this. And if there was salt in the sweat, they wouldn't purchase the person. I always find that kind of intense. I just want to make sure there was nothing else I left off there. Okay, I think we're good. Oh! Does anyone know what I was referring to when I said second only to the city of Cooper, Ashley, and Indigo, mid-April azaleas, Sumter, and Rice? Anyone know?
Charleston.
So here's something else for you to think about. Not only, wow, we don't really talk about slavery much in the North. Well, up until 1830, which is when slavery basically ended in New York was only second to Charleston, South Carolina in terms of the per capita population of its enslaved people. Second, something to think about, but we don't talk about slavery in the North, right? So I want to build this bridge, Corporate Canyon, talk about Wall Street in the 21st century, because there's no way you can think about Wall Street if you really know its history without thinking about slavery. It would not have grown to what it did without the peculiar institution, as some call it. Something else you might not know of. I mean, we could think about technology, iPhones, whatever. In 1830, the most widely traded commodity in the Western world was cotton. Who's picking that? Black people. Are they getting paid? The economic engine, because there was an intense relationship between the North and the South in terms of the economy, right? Most of the slave ships that were built in this country were built in the North, right? Anyway, so this is called Corporate Canyon, using sort of the diction of today. But think about that last piece I read. Corporate Canyon, economic oracle, bull, bear, the House of Morgan, occupy a gilded age, Black Tuesday or Thursday, two worlds, old and new, American Cotton Oil Company, Unilever, American Sugar Company, Domino Sugar, American Tobacco Company, Gold Standard, Skyscrapers, Roaring Twenties, Great Depression, New Deal, Ambition, monthly economic menses, high rise, market low, economic downturn, Standard and Poor, corporate culture, 20 trillion, mortgage-backed toxicity, lower Manhattan, upper crust, cocaine, cash, heat sealed, dealer, little plastic office casket, controlling interest, unfortunate 500, headquarters, global instability, stock values, plummet, migraine, soar, trading volume, wingtip, corporate canyons, foolproof, deregulate, speculative, revelatory, regulatory, Dow Jones, one-laners, innumerable, millions of shares and shares alike, and after dark. That's my 5-minute warning. Playing by the rules. And after dark, economic mortuary, ornate facades, economic facade, insiders trading, 3,000 people shrieking, 7.5 hours, tri-state area, economic aria, Stanley, Federal, Merrill, Reserve, Lynch, castles of glass, fire sale, bailout, global sell-off, out, daily, dose, heyday, divisor, broker, buyer, seller, trader, executives, execute, investment, bankruptcy, economic epicenter, stagflation, decline, deceit, mild recovery, record high, 16, respectable gains, exceeds, vanities, Lehman and Brooks Brothers, menstitutions, recession, peaks and troughs, fire sale, disreputable, naked short sale, drop, Trinity Church, dividend, wafers on earth, sought after commodity, Wall Street, principal, wolf of, apparel, Caterpillar, entertainment, Cola, Visa, Coca, Boeing, antitrust, the big board, trading day, a Bell's opening and closing, bad bets, stock splits, junk bonds, float adjustment, Ponzi schemes, firms, Apple, fast economic food, Inc., dot-com bubble, aerospace, Intel, greed is good, Corporal Electric, subprime mortgage, McDonald's, software, Walt, Nike, profit posting, largest collapse in 45 minutes, 2.2 trillion in total in just over 72 hours. That's a wrap, baby. See if I can get away with 2 more here, you know. That was my 5-minute warning. But, you know, Unilever, right? Let me make sure I'm doing it right. You know, Domino Sugar, American Sugar Company. That's going back into the 18th century. American Cotton Oil Company became Unilever. These are companies that still exist. This is called the Bodies of Metropolis. There were 2 quote-unquote slave revolts. This one in 1741. It's specious as to whether or not this happened, but there were 10 fires in 3 weeks, and it was blamed on a number of enslaved Negroes. And one of the interesting things, there was more kind of fluidity between white and black, because most of the enslaved lived in the houses of their masters, in the cellars or attics. There were a good amount of free Negroes, so it was a kind of porous nature to how things went, right? So the Irish, either Irish American or Irish, were often of the lower economic strata, and sometimes they had a greater kind of relationship with African Americans. Sometimes it got really ugly, like the riots in New York after the Civil War or during the Civil War. But there was an enslaved man named Caesar who had a friend named John Hewson, who was Irish, who owned a tippling house, which is, you know, baby, where you get your drink on, right? I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Caesar used to, he was a petty thief, and he would take things and bring them to Houston, and Houston would, you know, sell them and give Caesar money. So these fires started, and Houston's servant named Mary said that it was Caesar and these Ethiopians, as they were sometimes called, who did this, along with Houston, and it wasn't true. It turned into all this hysteria. How many white women were hung during the Salem witch hunt? Anyone know? None. Oh, no, excuse me, not hung, burnt at the stake. There were none. There were 2 slave revolts in New York. In this one, there were 13 folks burned at the stake. 2 of them, no. Well, let's just leave it at 13. And then in the one earlier in 1712, there were 20. Why did we never hear about this, right? So this is called the Bodies of Metropolis, and I'm using this extended figure, this conceit, later on, because I use different parts of the bodies of the 2 men, because Houston and Caesar were hung. They were hung for robbery first, but then they hung them again, right, on this little island. They put them beside each other because they wanted to say, if you step out of line, this is what's going to happen to you. And literally their bodies, they left them there for months and their bodies were like dripping. It was in the middle of the summer. I mean, just reading about it was just incredibly gross. Okay, it's called The Body is a Metropolis. And Geneva was a type of gin back then. Through a chilly side door opening onto June's alley, Caesar slipped into hog shop, palmed silver, linen, and pieces of 8, squirreled housewares under his master's floorboards. But robbery turned to conspiracy when a snitch-lipped servant girl claimed that February at Houston's tippling house, seated before a leg of mutton and drams of rum, Caesar, 6 other Ethiopians, and Houston, the girl's master, hatched a plan to start at the fly market and paint the city in flames. For the slave codes, the stop frolic, the no stroll after church out. Indentured Mary's tongue a tackling spatula. And just like the goose Houston had her serve those sable seeds of ham, she wanted to make sure those men were cooked on both sides. Echoing in April 3 decades ago, May, shadowy glen betwixt Windmill and Potbaker's Hill. That winter still with Caesar, the Negra emperor, when from the gallows for the burglary he cinched. The floor refusing his twitching feet, his body a weapon used against him, its weight as if he were crawling on his jaw. Never confessed, pride, father of pig-headed death. 2. But Caesar's ending ends again, drooped for light and heat they couldn't pin on him. Cut down, rehung, swinging in chains from a gibbet on an island in the Little Collect. A body left to rot is a message and a metropolis. Caesar's head is ablaze, a March 18th, his thoughts Fort George. Caesar's pate is Wednesday, the harbor viewed from a hill, chapel bells, a lull of wood, gunpowder that could blow, but the fort burned down because of a plumber's soldering iron. Caesar's tongue is a soon quench, a captain's house near the Long Bridge, on March 25th, the faulty chimney's fault. Caesar's shoulder was a warehouse by a dockside owned by Van Sant. Caesar's shoulder had a haystack, was a deal board near the East River. Caesar's shoulders were 3 fires, 3 Wednesdays in a row, was an April 1st to the ground burned and a little fishy, was what would another Wednesday have in store, pinned on a corncob pipe. Caesar's kidney was a cow stable at the fly market, dusk on April 4th. Caesar's kidney was alarming, a lane of maidens where roofs were palms and smoke never got out of hand or haystack. Caesar's kidney was getting suspicious, was proof of the fact that fear shares 3 letters with fire. Caesar's spleen was nearby and soon thereafter, a cry of fire before old smokes cleared. Caesar's spleen was a flicker aloft where a slave slept. Caesar's spleen was soon extinguished and Thomas's place was arson as African art. 3. John Hewson, Irish potato bobbing in an Anglican pot. Hewson, scrawny in a city swollen with property owners. He fenced stolen goods for the Geneva Club Negroes, hid coins for Caesar that Caesar had pocketed. Render unto Caesar things that are Caesar's. But when the court offered Irish Mary, Hewson's loose-lipped servant, freedom, she couldn't credit the enslaved with spearheading the plot. Hewson had to emboss this ring. Her words wrung John's neck. On a final ride from the city, him standing, warty tree toads chortling. 4. Chained to a gibbet beside Caesar, Hewson too gives up and up his own ghost twice. Another body left to rot, memorandum to a metropolis. Hewson's mouth was a Sunday morning, was Murray's coach house, was Nestle Coles in a haystack. Hewson's mouth was April 5th on Laura Broadway, was a trail of embers snaking to the neighbors. Hewson's mouth was a mild suspicion of a Negro in there. Hewson's mouth was a proud parent letting their fire go out for the first time on its own. Hewson's belly was 4 more fires all on Monday. No, that's not true. Hewson's belly was 10 a.m., was Mr. Burns's chimney. Hewson's neck was 2 hours later, was Hilton's roof just east of Sarley's, was up in flames, was evidence. Hewson's tear ducts were vigilantes, Monday's interruption. Hewson's tear ducts were magistrates, Spanish Negroes, and 4 o'clock. Hewson's tear ducts would take a seat, but give it back. Because Hewson's liver was an alarm in a warehouse on New Street. Because Hewson's liver was fire on a shingle's heels where smoke tottered. Because Hewson's liver was a Negro in a blue coat with a red lining in flight. Hewson's lung was the final cry and temper tantrum. Hewson's lung was Negroes rising like a mutiny of smoke. Hewson's lung was what wasn't yet, a nation, what it would have prayed for. But right now, it only had a God and a bottomless hunger for a country. Last piece. Thank you, Mr. Hovis. Thank you, Africana and Latino Studies Department. It's been a nice long ride. Along the city's jawline. So this is about the revolution that happened in 1712, right? So about 30 years prior. And as I said, there were people who were burned at the stake, hung, but one gentleman was broken on the wheel. Does anyone know what I mean when I say someone, what does that mean?
They kind of strapped him up and turn it.
Turn what?
They pulled him apart.
No, but what do they turn?
The wheel.
Right. But it isn't always that just pulling them apart. Sometimes they would take like cudgels and sticks and smash bones of your body. So this is about a man named Klaus, an enslaved man who was caught in part of this conspiracy, and he's broken on the wheel. So it's called Along the City's Jawline. And I thank you all for being here, really. Along the City's Jawline, 1712 New York Slave Revolt. Along the city's jawline, by the wharf where countless slaves were auctioned, Klaus might have heard tell how Robin sunk a penny knife into the palm of his owner's back, might have been privy to the revolts before or after, might have offered a con Robin that night for shelter in the wee hours of an April morn. Now he finds himself barefoot, stripped to the waist, spread eagle, bound to a wagon wheel, spokes versed in grass and its green obedience. Mud's scorched metamorphosis, the way falling snow delivers snow piecemeal from the heavens, a cobble's infinite calm. His body stretched, slowly rotated on that wheel. Klaus absorbs its stories, the dust, the turns, the deliveries, each journey's arm and leg, the living in a wagon's exacting shadow. The executioner seldom traffics in compassion and punishes Klaus bottom up. First, a sledgehammer rains on his shins. Jesus have mercy, he prays and rotates until they snap into gaps of the wheel. A wooden cudgel sings to his kneecaps. He yodels and rotates till they shatter between wooden spokes in the wheel. Even the chalky, taunting throng winces. Then an iron bar's blows administered to his forearms. He groans and rotates till they're smashed in some gaps in the wheels. The elbows, the chest, the endless bone cracking, caught a quarter-mile away, until, against God's own architecture, each limb dips like fractured black hammocks. On the commons, between Broadway and Kip, the wheels nailed high on a pole, sparrowhawks, oblivious and swift, pecking at the broken body. For 4 days, he's buoyed bloody laundry, only death has the stomach to dry. So Professor Morgan said that if you might want to ask some questions other than why am I so intense, you're welcome to ask those. I don't have an answer for that one, that's why I said it. About the work or anything else along those. Yes, sir.
Why are you so intense?
Okay, we got jokes.
Two of the poems that stood out to me, one was the one about the medical students, and then the last one you just read. They seem different stylistically from the other ones, or the other ones were kind of these very lyrical, like inspirations and project. Those were sounded more like prose, they were more structured and organized. What was it about those poems that kind of called that style?
I never thought about them sounding like prose. I tend to write narrative poems, but you said they were, you said the other ones were more lyrical, you're saying?
Well, no, it's not, it's just...
No, it's okay. I'm just looking for clarity. I'm not going to cry.
It's just like some things that were one together very smoothly, but the other ones were like complete sentences.
The medical school one and the last one, you're saying they felt like
just that kind of structure.
complete sentences. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. No, it's fine. I'm trying to kind of, because there were other pieces that were sort of narrative, or that's what I think you're kind of getting at. So, I guess I would just sort of say there may be more narrative in the way they're kind of distilled, and there was no intentionality. Well, with the question ones, there's a sense of fragmentation, clearly, and maybe with the piece about the body as a metropolis, that's kind of like this, like I said, this extended metaphor, this conceit, and using different parts of the body to sort of represent the events of each fire, because they're punished, their bodies are, desecrated basically. So I was thinking, your tongue is that first fire, and your ear is the second fire, and then I'm sort of giving you some of the narrative, but in a truncated and maybe syncopated sort of way of what actually happened. Because to write, I don't know, I guess I could have wrote 10 different poems about the fires, but I thought this was a kind of more interesting way to kind of enter that, and still keeping the bodies of these men that were so violated integral to these fires, that the likelihood is maybe one of those fires was started by some of the enslaved, right? So I don't know if I answered your question. I never have thought about it that way, so maybe that's why I'm not answering it maybe the way you would like me to answer it. Yes, ma'am.
I have 2 questions.
Yeah, it's okay.
You're a poet, right?
I hope so. Or else I was wasting your time here for the last 40 minutes and wasting mine too. Go ahead.
Is that like what you do with like your profession? Like,
Say again.
Is that like your profession? Do you do something else?
Well, I do teach some graduate courses online, and I perform as an actor also. I do, Professor Hovis mentioned, I do a show of the work of Langston Hughes and also Dr. King. But yeah, about 75% of what I put in my pocket every year is from either readings or presentations,
And my second question is,
why are you up there?
with the Cemetery of the Bones, have you guys figured anything out yet, or
Figured out?
like, has there any been advances in figuring out who those people are? Or
No,
beyond
that's
that?
not going to happen.
No.
I mean, it's
You're
just not going to
really-
happen. Because let me try to explain something to you. And I would have read another piece that kind of commented on it. Basically, imagining you're having to work a whole day, and there's a phrase that the enslaved would say, working from can't see to can't see, right? So you might be up at 5 in the morning. If it was summertime, you might not finish work until 9 o'clock at night. It's not like there was some church they went to have funerals. And there were laws passed saying they couldn't bury people at night. When else were they going to bury them? They're working all day, right? So they would kind of go a little further up, from where the burial ground might be, and try to bury people after these laws were passed, so that the whites and the Common Council, whomever, might not see these people. There was no headstone they could make, or carve someone's name in it. So other than that name, by virtue of this man being paid to make a casket for that guy Joseph Castens, there are 2 or 3 first names that they know, and they're all women, one named Molly, one named Jane, one named Rosine, that they know are buried there. There are names of enslaved people. I just gave you Caesar's name, right? Maybe he's buried there, but who knows where? So we have names of people, but we don't know where they are, and they might not even be buried there, because where Caesar in Houston was, it was a little island and there was a pond. Maybe they just melted and kicked them, shoved them into the water, the bones that were remaining, So the only, if you would, the progress is the fact that they established the burial ground, because actually it still is a federal building, and this is why even they were rediscovered. They built a building called the Ted Weiss Federal Building, and some African Americans in New York heard some rumblings that there might be some bones down there, and started protesting, blah, blah, blah. And so at least they were able to establish a museum, and they were able to take 419 of the bodies and give them, quote unquote, a proper burial, but the building is still there. And then these archaeologists and anthropologists and forensic scientists, like with the piece I read about the woman being shot, so they were able to, with some of them, ascertain how they died and some of the illnesses they suffered from. One of the things that was really intense, it was a piece I was going to share, oftentimes the Northerners were like, oh, well, yeah, we do this, but it's not as bad as in the South. That's a lie, okay? Maybe they weren't working on a plantation. There were a number of bodies that they were able to determine that part of why they died is because the muscle separated from the bone on their body. That's how hard they were worked. Could you imagine that? Yes, sir.
As you were doing, it's a question about writing, poetry and research, and the linkage between the two.
Right.
Did you go about, you had to do a lot of research about
The burial ground.
specific burial ground, specific period of time,
Sure.
what New York City was about at that time,
Yeah.
and at the same time, you had to take that set of information and put it into poetry. Was there any kind of logic to how you did this? Did you first do the research, then write the poetry, or did you kind of do both at the same time? How did you go about that?
I mean, sometimes I mean, I started reading first because there's a lot of information I just didn't know, and I'd actually gone to the site a number of times, had no idea it was 15,000, had no idea it was the oldest slave cemetery in the United States, and in that book that Professor Hovis was referring to, I have a sonnet about a slave cemetery in Virginia. You would think, oh yeah, the largest one would be in the South, and the oldest one would be in the South. It's New York City. So it was like surreal. So I read about 6 books about New York and slavery, blah, 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 and then read articles. And so sometimes in medias res, I might like start composing a piece because of something that just hit me so intensely, like the Body is a Metropolis thing. There's a great book called New York is Burning by a professor from Harvard named Jill Lepore. If you get a chance, you should read it. It's just about that 1741, I call it conspiracy. And like just sort of about halfway through that, it was just like, yeah, like boom, like this is just rolling out of me. But then, you know, I'd say at least more than half, it was sort of after I finished reading at least 4 books, and I was like, okay, what's happening here? There are these repeated things from this book to that book. And then you didn't so much ask in this way, but I think what's also in that question is, how do you make history sing? Right? Because I could just write like a sociological treatise or a historical essay, right? I chose to put it in the container of poetry. So then it's about thinking about the musicality of the language and using figure, you know, metaphor and simile and things like that to hopefully like have things that will rest and resonate with you. Like I think there was a kind of reaction at the end of that piece assignment when I said hell at the end of the day, they were just homework. You know, like that's a metaphor, right? They're not really homework, but then again, maybe they are, right? So it's like, and then the sonic chime there with the first part of that sentence is the word hell, and the last word is homework, and they alliterate hell and homework, right? So looking for like that music that hopefully will like go bam, or syntactical sort of things with the music, with one of the questions with the woman who was shot, right? When the last thing she responds with, what we leave the earth, when we leave the earth, is not ours to say. And the lines break exactly how I'm reading. So you have these 2 lines with 5 syllables, right? And they both start with W words, what and when, right? And then there's that kind of parsing, excuse me, you know, the line ending on the second line, when we leave the earth, and then boom, is not ours to say. Also 5 syllables. So there's that syntactical balance that is it was a very deliberate thing as I'm revising to try to create music in the poem, right? So it doesn't hopefully, although I might have to talk with my friend over here who's, so that it doesn't just hopefully sit as like prose or kind of an iterative of, you know, this historical stuff you read, that you want to make it sing, right? And that was constantly a challenge. Yes?
The poems produce the horror of that experience so potently, and yet they are so incredibly beautiful. They're so musical. I'm wondering, what might you say about that tension between the horror and the beauty? I mean, is it transmuted, or is your goal to reproduce it with clarity, or?
I think it's a combination of both. I mean, Langston Hughes said in the essay, The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, we are ugly and we are beautiful. And that's the truth. All of us. First couple of times I read that piece of assignment, I just would break down by the end of it, you know. So yeah, you try to bring some beauty, but yeah, there is the ugly, and you're hoping there's sort of a way that you're not, and this is like, even when I was like, hey, I'm a little nervous about reading, it's like, you don't want people like walking out like, oh, this is just a downer, man. This is that truth. So trying to figure out ways. I mean, my ex-partner, when I read her that last piece that you said, you know, was more poetic for you. I mean, she was just like, this is really beautiful, but it's just really hard to hear this. It's really hard to visualize it. It's hard to think about this. And I didn't quite get it, because at that point I was so inside of this thing, you know, it had been just, you know, just writing this was like a 7 or 8 month project that just consumed me. So I couldn't really, you know, kind of step back from that and imagine how it might be impacting someone, because I'm just trying to really distill these stories as sort of lyrically and honestly and beautifully as possible. I saw somebody, yeah.
I was just gonna say you did a good job. I found it very moving. And it was very beautiful. Especially when certain words you emphasize them, or when I'm not very poetic.
That's
I'm not
okay.
good at writing, but certain words, the way you phrase them together, the contrast or the paradox, you made it very moving. You made it a good point. Why we have to realize this, even though it is something that is hard to talk about, but it is in our past. Like you said, it's ugly, but it's beautiful. It just makes us who we are.
Yeah, and I guess again, one of the things is because of the whole kind of narrative of, you know, the South, if you would, right? And yet, second to Charleston, New York City, how many people would imagine that? How many people have a sense that when you think about Wall Street, and that's why I read you the piece Corporate Canyon as well, the very groundings of that place are rooted in the slaveocracy. How many people even have any inkling of this? The stock market's at 26,000. Where would that be relative to those ships that were coming in that you could smell before you even saw them? How gross must that have been?
There's something you said about how art being used to dismantle the colonized narrative of history. Do you think it's an effective way to kind of change our perception or assumptions about history? It's definitely something that has been written to be one-sided or
Meaning history. Okay. Well, I mean, history is generally speaking written by the conquerors, but I do think there's a whole lot of work, thankfully, over time that some of those who were conquered or marginalized or maligned, they're telling their stories too. I don't necessarily like to get into romanticizing about art or whatever it is. I do what I do, and you hope that there will be some who will be impacted by it. I mean, it's not going to be the Me Too movement or these kids in Florida, but maybe 15 or 20 people down the road will read some of this work and say, hey, maybe I need to dig into a little bit more of what the slaveocracy was like in the North. I mean, you have Phyllis Wheatley, who was enslaved in Boston. You have Jupiter Hammond, who was enslaved in New York. And the very first African-American that we know of who wrote a poem was Lucy Terry. She was enslaved in Rhode Island. Right? So hopefully, people kind of read it and go, oh man, I can't believe this happened. And maybe it makes you think about other things, if whatever your pursuits might be historically, or, you know what I'm saying, in terms of what you're studying, and you think about how can I resurrect something that has been sort of pushed to the side. I mean, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Margaret Atwood. Okay, so I'm trying to remember the name of the book. It has the word house in it, but she has this incredible poem in there about a woman who was part of the Salem witch hunts. Her name is Half-Hanged Mary. Any of you ever heard of her? Half-Hanged Mary. So she was actually hung, and she survived. So Atwood has this 14 or 15 section poem about her. And I mean, if you have a heart and you read this, you can't not be moved.
Please forgive my ignorance, but is the United States the only country in the world that had these atrocities towards?
No, I mean, Brazil,
it happened everywhere else?
Yeah, I mean, just even relatively recently, I mean, you could think about King Leopold from Belgium. I mean, there were 10 million, they say, likely Congolese killed while he was, he never actually went to the Congo, which is ironic, but while he was sort of presiding over the Congo. You have Rwanda. I mean, there are any number of these things. I mean, I was just talking with Professor Compton. I went to Cambodia, maybe it was 3 years ago, and Pol Pot. He was the head of the Khmer Rouge, and there's this glass building. I mean, it's like surreal. It might not be, it's probably about half the size of this room, right? But it goes up about 8 stories, and it's full of skulls of people who were working under Pol Pot, who ran the Khmer Rouge, this kind of military, paramilitary force in Cambodia, right? Of people that they killed. And Pol Pot, I mean, this is even bizarre, and forgive me for saying this, he was so cheap that he wouldn't waste bullets on people. So he would invent any number of ways to kill people. Hit them with the butt of a gun. Babies, they would swing them up against a tree, and smash their heads. And so the way this building is structured, you can see all these skulls, it's glass, and they have like little circle dots that they put on them with different colors, and you can look down below and see, this was a baby who was slammed against a tree. This was a mother who had, the butt of a rifle smashed against her head. Any other questions? While we're on the topic. Yes.
So the poems you just read were very audio-wise, I don't know, they were very, you could listen to them more. Do you have other poetry that is more of like a visual experience that the structure is of a visual intent and not so much audio?
When you say visual, meaning like how it looks on the page?
Yeah.
Well, even if it did look a certain way on the page, which some of them do, how would you know unless you looked at the page? And I'm not trying to be snarky.
No, I just mean you said you have a book of poems, right?
Right.
So some poems are a different experience when read out loud versus when you read them. Did you only share with us the ones that you felt were more of a listen, or
No.
Are there
Well,
other
let me. I don't know if this is where you're going with this, but I have no problems with people who ascribe to this, but I hate the term spoken word. Okay? Everybody speaks words. What does that mean? What does that mean? I'm not saying I hate anyone who does it if they do whatever they're doing well. I don't understand what that is. Everyone speaks words. So, I'm saying that because I write for the page. Right? I don't sit there and go, this sounds like it would sound nice coming out of my mouth. I'm not even thinking about that at all. I'm concerned about what's going on the paper. If you look, there's quatrains, there are couplets, there's different line endings, as I was saying to you before with that response. What we leave the earth, when we leave the earth, it's not ours to say. That is deliberate 5-syllabic things in 3 lines, and we're also having this syntactical, or what would be called a paratactic parallel with what we leave the earth, when we leave the earth. So that's not, how does that sound? And I'm not being derisive in saying that, I'm just saying I spend many hours just sitting with a piece of paper and looking at what's happening on the paper. What might happen is I'm an actor, and so maybe in the rendering it conveys, and that could be a good or a bad thing, it might have a sort of dramatic flair that might make you think, this is just this guy, who's kind of he can get up there and, do some soft shoe, and there's nothing going on this piece of paper. I hope there's something going on there, because I've wasted a lot of time if there isn't.
I just meant it's performed well. I don't know if it would be the same if someone else said it out loud.
Maybe not, but what I would hope, whether or not it's the same if someone else read it out loud, what I would hope, humbly, is that if you read them on paper, and I wasn't there, that you would be moved. That's what I'm hoping for. I understand that I have a certain facility because I am an actor. So there are things that hit me, there are things I used to do voiceover, so yes, there are certain tools I bring to the conveying of words. But I spend, as a matter of fact, the only thing I did in terms of the orality for today, because Professor Hovis said I had a certain amount of time, so I just timed them. I read them to myself, and I literally took my cell phone, they got everything in them, pretty soon they'll have microwaves in them, right? And, it's just timing, so I know that I'd stay within his time. That took me 40 minutes. some of these poems I worked on for 30 to 40 hours. Might seem, I don't know, slapdash, but not at all. Not at all. I'm saying in the craft on the page, you get me? Just on the page. Nothing to do with performance or thinking about performance, because for me, I hope, I'm glad that it did kind of affect you on a performative level, but I'm really concerned that they work as literature. Because I won't be here forever, right? And I hope somebody might read.
We have time for maybe one more question, and then speaking words on the page, books for sale in the back. So,
and my book was a finalist for a prize, so you wouldn't necessarily be doing this for charity if you wanted to buy a copy. You'd probably enjoy what's on the page, or at least some of what's on the page. Doctor, do you have a question, Dr. Roman?
Oh, yes. Maybe